they appeased Catholicism, the Roman Empire, would try to claim that those worlds were definitely under the Catholic rule. Hence, they had to be annexed to the empire in a way or another. So, ceding to Catholicism from these German rulers wasn't just a matter of culture or identity or pride. It surely existed by a certain margin, but it was a matter of saying, we don't want to be Roman subjects. We are Germans. We conquered these lands in arms. This is our land because God gave it us, and we won't give it up, right? And this was also a problem because, of course, originally speaking, the Roman threat was quite concrete. I mean, especially in the Mediterranean, as Justinian's reconquest would prove. I mean, the Vandals were knocked out, the Ostrogoths were knocked out, the Burgundians and the Visigoths kind of saved their own skins because basically the Byzantines had outreached their capabilities at that point, but still were fundamentally within that system. They were also pretty weak. Like, even in the last, in the 6th of the 5th century, even the Western Roman Empire had arrived into Spain, had managed to reconquer it. The Visigoths said, okay, we surrender, use us as federati like we were before. Just because the Vandals made it to stop Majorianus, the thing evolved in that sense, but actually even the Western Empire could theoretically reabsorb these populations. So they felt threatened, and rightfully so. Now, Ostrogothic Italy represented the most powerful bulk of this stuff, right? The Ostrogoths had kind of problems on their own. Now we will see how the conquest happened and how they dealt with the neighbors. But the concept is that by allowing freedom of religion, the Ostrogoths were saying, okay, we don't persecute anyone in here, and this should be our safe pass for not being attacked by a Catholic power like Constantinople was. And I mean, Italy is pretty close to Constantinople. I mean, the Byzantines had their own fleet. They could easily, and they would easily, invade Italy at that point during the Gothic War. So this was all a very clever religious policy that Theodoric had the far-sightedness to enact. Just for the record, I would like to add that even the other Romano-Germanic kingdoms weren't actually so harsh with the local Catholic elites. Like, all this myth that, I don't know, the Vandals persecuted, destroyed, is not backed by any evidence. Archaeologically speaking, we know that the churches kept standing. Of course, there was probably a substitution of local clergy, but there wasn't an active repression, like people butchered down because they were Catholic. That's pretty stupid. If you have to rule over millions of people that represent your labor force, your economic power, your agricultural surplus, at least what they can produce, you don't persecute them. It's pretty damn stupid. That would fare into civil war. When you find struggles between the two parties, like the pro-Arian and pro-Catholic parties, that's mostly a struggle within the same Germanic elites. That, of course, is backed also by the local Roman elites. And in fact, Catholicism will win, but just on the long run. But it's mostly an internal instability at the base of the elites, not because the average person was persecuted because he was Catholic, right? It didn't work like that. And actually, we know, now this is fascinating because, for example, we depicted the Vandals as sort of villains in a way or another, right? Why? Because the Roman papacy, exactly when Theodoric was settled in Italy, was writing about the Vandals that were essentially monsters and heathens and whatever. Why? Because they were enemies to the Italic region as such, strategically speaking, where Rome was and where the Ostrogoths were, that were Arians. So the accusation of paganism that, because the Vandals were Arians, was mounted up just because the Vandals basically had, by controlling Tunisia, they basically had taken out from Italy this major source of grain that had always been historically there during the Roman Empire, and therefore the Vandals were the villains. Hence, you're a Vandal, because we remember the ancient Vandals. But that's essentially papal propaganda. And I'm not saying that, the popes were some of the most intelligent, clever, capable, and smart political actors of all times. I'm not saying this is not a critic to papacy. This is actually saying how freaking intelligent they were for us to make believe such things still today, when you think of Vandals as a bunch of martyrs, and I made a video about the Vandals and such. But you have to understand it on the political lines of the time. You have to stay open in this sense. And Theodoric, and this is very important, did try to appease the Pope, right? And tried to keep his alliance with the Church of Rome strong. The Church of Rome, right? Not necessarily Constantinople. Of course, Constantinople was Catholicism, was what the Nicene Creed embodied, and in spite of Arian fluctuations that had happened even within the same Eastern Roman Empire back in the day, and surely the heterodox tendencies of the Constantinopolitan Church wouldn't be over. But here it was about appeasing the Roman Pope, that is, major spiritual figure in Italy, and also by that point already the major spiritual figure in the West, that was already starting to feel not outside the empire, because the fall of the West didn't mean literally and absolutely and totally nothing in that sense, but simply in the sense of saying, okay, now there is not just a state, there is also a spiritual figure, there is a churchly figure that we follow, and that we prefer to start seeing as a sort of alternative to other powers, and which was very clever, especially for all these other Westerners who rightfully wanted to autonomize themselves from the empire. I mean, as any other power wants to do when it's left on its kind of freer, right? So Theodoric ability to work well with Italy's nobles, members of the Roman Senate, and the Catholic Church all helped facilitate his acceptance as the ruler of Italy. And that's what this great power of Ostrogothic Italy, that comprehended at one point also Provence and Raetia and Pannonia, parts of Illyria and Dalmatia. It was pretty big. It wasn't just Italy, right? It was basically, for example, Corsica and Sardinia were Vandal, but Theodoric basically ransomed back Sicily from the Vandals, interestingly enough. That was important because the Vandals theoretically had all to benefit from getting, let's say, far from the empire, but paradoxically, even if they were knocked out by the empire eventually, they still feared the Ostrogoths because they were like between Italy and Spain, and they didn't feel very, very at ease with that. So they partially contributed, especially in alliance with the Franks more than with the Byzantines, to work maybe a little bit against the Goths. So we will see now what we are talking about. Theodoric sought furthermore to revive Roman culture in government, and in doing so profited the Romano-Italic populations as well. It was both in both characters together that he set out in 488 by commission from the Byzantine Emperor Zeno to recover Italy from Odoacer. Odoacer had been the chieftain basically of the Germanic corps that were stationed in Italy as the army of Italy. So Odoacer, I think, was appointed king of Italy, Rex Italiae, but or in Italia, I don't remember, in Italia actually, stressing that there wasn't quite a kingdom of Odoacer, but that he was just a guy who was in charge of the local federati troops that were stationed in Italy. Now, Theodoric does something different. Also, he sets in motion all these big. Also, here the relation between the empire and Odoacer is pretty ambiguous, because Odoacer actually made a favor to the Byzantines in sending back the Western imperial insignia to Constantinople. So basically, reverting all the power to Constantinople and saying, okay, here we don't re-elect any emperor anymore, because that doesn't work. It had become a miserable business at that point. You say, you know what, we don't elect any other emperor fundamentally, because now it was elected by the army de facto, right? So Odoacer wasn't a big threat. I mean, he didn't probably have even a big deal of power, but the Byzantines thought, well, that the Ostrogoths now were too much pain behind in the Danubian area, because they feared constantly that they could do something, dangerous for them. So they sent, they give them full paper. They say, okay, invade Italy, knock out Odoacer. As long as you go there, you rule on our behalf, you become Rex Italiae as an Ostrogothic king, and it's fine. So that's how it began in 489. Even the Rugi, this other population from Rugiland, this area that even from the island of Rügen, you can understand this Baltic area between Scandinavia and Germany was all the point of passage of all the Germanic peoples, allegedly. Even the Longobards passed there. I mean, it was all these peoples who gravitated around the Germanism in the sense of always, now migrating, getting somewhere else, in bearing arms and occupying new lands, right? It was a big deal. When you find these big expeditions of peoples like the Ostrogoths, or even the Longobards later, you don't have to think of just the single people, but literally whoever could come there to participate, because the larger you were, the greater was the success. It was really a demographic problem as well, right? And so there were lots of other populations, including Romanized or even Roman populations, right? These weren't just barbarians. There were maybe people, I don't know, Roman or Romanized peoples that lived in Illyria that decided to join Theodoric in the invasion of the Italian peninsula. So even the Rugi, for example, this Germanic tribe who dwelt in the Hungarian plain, joined the Ostrogoths in their invasion of Italy under their leader Frederick. By 493, Ravenna, the administrative capital of Italy, was taken. You know that Ravenna is this city into fundamentally northern Italy on the Adriatic Sea, where the capital, the formal administrative capital, had been shifted because it was an area objectively, it was well connected with the east via the port and also surrounded by marshes, so it was easily defendable. Even though Rome was always, the ideal capital, right? Even Milan had been capital of the west of Italy, etc. And history wants of this 3-year siege of Ravenna that would become kind of epic. Even the Longobards in their history, Paul the Diagon says that when they invaded Italy, they besieged Pavia for 3 years. Instead, there is no evidence at all of that. It even doesn't make sense in the specific context, just because it was this great accomplishment that Theodoric had done. So this expedition was probably fueled even with some ideological meanings, right? This was the Romans literally sending the Goths to invade Italy, but from the Gothic perspective, it was much more than that. It was the Goths invading Italy, the core land, the heartland from which the empire had been born, the center of Romanity. The first thing Theodoric does, as we have seen, when Ravenna falls, is to go to Rome to render homage to the Roman Senate and to the Roman papacy, right? It's a very important message, a very meaningful symbol. So you can imagine, now you understand why the epics of Theodoric in the Germanic sagas, with Dietrich von Bern, also in the in all the stories revolving on this mythical past, it was so echoing here, because Theodoric was considered as one of the greatest Germanic rulers ever lived, right? Theodoric would set up his capital in Ravenna as well. It was also at this time that Odoacer was killed by Theodoric's own hand, allegedly. Therefore, Ostrogothic power was thus fully established over Italy, Sicily, Dalmatia, and the lands to the north of Italy, essentially the Alpine area. All the Alps up to the Danube were under the control of the Ostrogoths from Ravenna. Now, this is very important because the Alps, as you understand, were quite a bulwark. It's also very interesting to look at the Ostrogothic settlement on a geographical base. You know that at one point there was some land, as we have seen before with the Hospitalitas, that was basically confiscated by the conquerors for settling their own warriors. That was the deal. All what these Germans had been wandering around for was objectively settling down at one point. Italy was considered rightfully one of the most advanced and prosperous lands not just of the Mediterranean, but and this was a great prize for these faring Germans. And in the settlement of the Ostrogothic warriors took naturally also a strategic dimension. They were settled chiefly in the north and controlling the Alpine passes. Also certain core land of the Apennines, certain important passes always. There weren't many in the south, but yes as well there. And the Alpine area was very important because Italy was connected with Central Europe at this point. And many of the peoples, like the Alemanni, for example, or the Thuringians, etc., that were pressed by Frankish expansionism, now looked at the Goths as the major allies against Merovingian expansionism. It's very interesting because the Alemanni that were crushed by Clovis at the Battle of Tolbiac were in fact resettled. They obtained to be settled into what would be today's Swiss territory under Ostrogothic rule under Theodoric. And to be settled, in fact, as especially controlling these Alpine passes as well to counter Merovingian expansionism, that at that time was quite of a big deal, because frankly, talking about the Franks, next step would be for the Merovingians to in fact invade Italy, which is what they basically tried to do at the end of the Gothic War when the Goths were knocked out. If it hadn't been for the Longobards who fulfilled the gap later on, the same situation of the 8th century with Charlemagne would have presented itself, because for the Franks, and historically speaking for France, of a time of, Francis I, of Louis XIV, of Napoleon, would be to invade Italy as a natural next step. And for the control of the Mediterranean, of course, and so the presence of the Ostrogoths in the Italian peninsula was of pivotal importance for the world balance of power in the West. The Merovingians were also expanding against the Visigoths that naturally were sympathizing with the Ostrogoths at this point. And in fact, the expansion of the Ostrogoths in Provence would basically connect with the Visigothic territories in southwestern Gaul and in Spain, in the Iberian Peninsula, and therefore closing the controlling the Gallic coast of the Mediterranean under a unified, a joint, let's say better, Gothic control that would prevent the Franks to occupy the Rhone Valley, that in fact connected the Mediterranean with central northern Europe, and their traffics also being one of the most radically and intensely Romanized lands of the whole empire. Basically, the Rhone Valley was as Romanized as Italy, and therefore making a lot of money. And those were in fact Roman areas. So this naturally worried the same Byzantines, because the Ostrogoths also maintained their own power into the Danubian area. They controlled, in fact, everything up to the Danube River, like the Roman borders had always been, and controlling also these internal areas of what would be today's, Croatia, Bosnia, and then partly of Hungary, right? That were militarized borders. I mean, they weren't much of a big deal in terms of wealth, but they still had a strategic meaning, right? And there were other peoples gravitating outside those borders that, as we said before, were seeing in the Goths an alternative to Roman rule, because they recognized them as Germans, they recognized them as Aryans, and this was kind of an answerance in a kind of shelter from this Catholic expansion and Roman-styled expansionism of the Franks in the west, and of course of the Byzantine Empire in the east, that for these peoples was quite important. So the power of Theodoric at this time was really big. Around 500 AD, Theodoric celebrated his 30th anniversary as king of the Ostrogoths, and he would rule for another 26 years. And in order to improve their chances against the Roman Empire, the Ostrogoths and Visigoths began again to unite in what became a loose confederation of Germanic peoples. Alright, so the Goths recognized now their common interests, their common origins, and they form this axis that aims to control the Western Mediterranean in anti-Byzantine and anti-Frankish function. The two branches of the nation were soon brought closer together after Theodoric was forced to become regent of the Visigothic kingdom of Toulouse. The power of Theodoric was practically extended over a large part of Gaul and over nearly the whole of the Iberian Peninsula. Right, this is very important. Theodoric also forged alliances with the Visigoths, Alemanni, same Franks, right, because they weren't open enemies, and also the Burgundians, and some of which were accomplished through diplomatic marriages. Right, so there was the marriages. Now we can't list them all, but they're very important, and they were at very high level between the Merovingians and the Amali dynasties, and it had theoretically to preserve this broader, the Franks weren't over yet with the Franks had their own power, but at this point were still a bit securing the whole area. That they didn't want to attack, especially the Ostrogoths, right? While they clashed actually against the Visigoths, even defeating them, as you know, in 507 at the Battle of Vouillé, for which basically the Visigoths would lose all what had been Aquitaine, so this first territories they had settled in, remaining just with the region of Septimania in southwestern Gaul. That is essentially this stripe of land on the Mediterranean that takes its name because it it was allegedly coverable in 7 days of on horseback. And in fact, the Visigoths would maintain that area, but which is right. It's from the Atlantic watershed, right? While the Franks would basically come to rule over the Atlantic one of Aquitaine. Different areas, right? And Aquitaine is much less urbanized and Romanized than actually the Narbonensis in that area of Septimania is. Sometimes people say, "Oh well, Aquitaine was so Romanized." Well, actually, no. I mean, there was a great Roman continuity simply because the Franks didn't quite occupy it. The Aquitanians remained kind of a even ethnical entity that had existed since the time of the Vascones, the Aquitani. That were something different from the same Celts. So there was a continuity, but it wasn't a dramatically urbanized area as actually the Narbonensis was. And there's a bit of confusion about this because what we call as Aquitania, historically speaking, is in fact the Atlantic watershed. But with Diocletian reorganization of the Roman, the administrative districts, Aquitaine came to encompass also parts of the former Gallia Narbonensis. It was actually the very urbanized one, like the part of the Rhone Valley in its west, in its east, and but they're still two very different things, both linguistically, economically. So, yeah, I mean, during the Middle Ages, these differences were partially blurry, but still they're very meaningful. And it's important to remember it. And of course, the Franks are still separated by the Ostrogoths. From the Ostrogoths, by the Alemanni, or what was remaining of them under Frankish rule, and in those lands where we have seen the Goths resettled them, and the Burgundians, that also were pretty they swept the switch side for what it was convenient to them, because they were not a very powerful entity, but they were still well placed into these areas of the Massif Central, the Jura Mountains, and therefore, according to convenience, they were peripheral both to the Franks and to the Goths, so they could try to save their skins in that sense. Eventually, they would fall under Frankish rule, but especially after the Ostrogoths fell, right? So that tells you how powerful Theodoric and Ostrogothic Italy were. So the Ostrogothic dominion under Theodoric was therefore once again as far-reaching, as splendid as it was in the time of Ermanaric, right? So this promise of the rising sun blessing the Goths probably appeared, according to the historical memories and values and beliefs of this people, once again in the sunny Italy, like a new promised land, right? Never underestimate this. Like, for peoples that had wandered for centuries across Eastern and Central Europe, what this meant was really great, right? It was really great. The Ostrogoths objectively had never inhabited such developed area like Italy, right? And this was really felt as a worthy prize, right? The core of the empire in their hands. As a consequence, now, however, Germanic, the situation, we can say, the condition of the Ostrogothic people had really changed a lot in character. Like, the dominion of Theodoric was not a barbarian one, but a civilized power. This meant a lot, also in terms of the sacrifice of the single Ostrogothic freeman, right? Theodoric twofold position ran through everything. He was at once king of the Goths and successor, though without any imperial titles, of the Western Roman emperors. Two nations, the Romans and the Germans, differing in manners, language, and religion, living side by side on the soil of Italy. Each was ruled according to its own law by the prince who was in his two separate characters the common sovereigns of both. Right. So this naturally presented some problems internally. Like, Theodoric was so powerful as a sovereign that he was able to keep control of most of what opposition could be. But you can imagine that if you were an Ostrogothic leader, aristocrat, with your own military clientele, etc., seeing your king basically siding with the Catholics and allowing the Romans even to participate to the consistorium at Ravenna, right? It was literally Romans and Germans sitting at the same table like equals under Ostrogothic direction. Was a very, very provocative thing. The Germans thought they had conquered that land by right, hence the Romans were subjects. Instead, Theodoric, by being supported essentially by both blocks for different reasons, was elevating himself above the same Ostrogothic people. So it is true that the Ostrogoths were already somewhat stratified socially since a very long time, but still, in a strictly Germanic perspective, this was considered like as a problem, because the Germans, of course, believed that at least for what the aristocracies were concerned, that every German was equal, was a freeman, and that the king was elected as a primus inter pares, not as a ruling dynasty, right? So this probably created tensions within the Ostrogothic nobility, like it had happened also elsewhere. Naturally, you can say that the most civilized and most intelligent part passed through the kind of the Roman side of the story. Like, of course, ruling a country like Italy or any other Romanized land of the empire couldn't entail on the long run to remain the ancient egalitarian Germanic thing. I mean, it was completely impossible. This was a very structured society. It was diversified. It was a lot of power, a lot of assets to control. It required a very sophisticated administration. The same Goths that were in charge of the military had inherited all the Roman infrastructures, the Fabrica Armorum for the for production of weaponry and armor. So the whole picture was destined to change, right? So this division between Romans and Germans, albeit being successful, couldn't last on the long run, because there were two models that could cooperate, but that would at one point mix into one another. And still, however, there were different allegiances to the empire, towards the empire. I mean, the Germans, the Goths in Italy knew perfectly well that supporting Theodoric meant to be strong as a people in the international arena against the Byzantine Empire, against also the Franks that were pushing from in the northwest. So they understood what that unity meant, but probably the general vision of this world was trying to waver. And due to Theodoric's ability to foster and leverage relations among the various Germanic kingdoms, the Byzantines began to fear Theodoric's power, right? And this led eventually to an alliance between the Byzantine Emperor and the Frankish king Clovis that was a pact designed to counteract and ultimately to overthrow the Ostrogoths. So you can say that in some ways Theodoric might have been overly accommodating both the Romans and the other Gothic people, as he placated Catholics and Arian Christians alike. There is a sort of contradiction in all of this. Basically, Theodoric's policy is constructive, is civil, it's intelligent, it's farsighted, but it can last for a while, right? It's good for that moment. It's incredible from a Germanic king that this could ever happen, and that's why we remember such experiment in the history books as one of the most successful of coexistence between Romans and Germans. But even a historian like Wolfram suggested that Theodoric's effort in trying to appease Latin and barbarian cultures and kind of brought about the collapse of the same Ostrogothic predominance, and also resulted in the end, quote, end of Italy as the heartland of late antiquity. Now, this is maybe, there is some truth into it, because it was not necessarily doomed to fail as a matter of the Ostrogothic kingdom of Italy. It was doomed to fail because there were enemies that actively exploited this weakness. Why? Because the major problem actually of the Goths in Italy was the Roman senatorial elite. I mean, if it depended on the local Romano-Italics, the Gothic government was actually pretty damn good. I mean, there was peace, there was stability. The Ostrogothic rule was much better than the one of the last Western Roman emperors and the one of Odoacer. So the people were happy. What wasn't happy was the Roman senators. The Roman senators were holding in the peninsula this enormous latifundia. Actually, the whole population was framed within this latifundia. So the peoples had much more against. I mean, the Romano-Italics had much more against the Roman senators than against the Ostrogoths as rulers. And the Roman senators inherently didn't. I mean, they had obviously accepted Theodoric's rule because they didn't have any other opportunity. After the defeat of Maiorianus, it was evident that Italic economic and demographic resources weren't enough to make of Italy an independent power with its own political and military force. So the Goths now had come to refill, even demographically speaking, the army and how it worked, and they were doing it fairly well. But the senators didn't want the Goths there. I mean, these were Romans. They were extremely highly educated people. I mean, the Italic elites were the singly most educated this time in the whole empire, and far more than the Byzantine ones. They felt, I mean, this thing that they were Romans, they descended from the ancient Roman family. They felt to be the true, to own the true legacy of the empire, and therefore they didn't want to share it with Germans. They were barbarians, right? And you have to understand them. I mean, they were objectively the main problem that made Ostrogothic Italy collapse. If, for example, after the Gothic War, this senatorial aristocracy was literally wiped out, and one of the reasons why the Longobards rule was so successful in Italy is that they didn't have the senators in the way to bother them and to counter them with their latifundia. So that the local population was very happy actually to embrace the Germanic middle small property owner, right, that model entailed. At the time of Theodoric, the Roman society with the latifundium, the elite, was still standing, and that was a problem. And these senators wanted to come back into the empire, right? So they were always plotting with Constantinople to overthrow Theodoric at one time. In fact, the last years of Saint Theodoric's reign were marked by this agitation and turmoil, and even the persecution actually between the Catholics and against the Catholics began once again against these elites, because even if the thing is more shaded than it sounds, exactly because this local elites that were fully Roman and fully Catholic were plotting against them. Even Boethius' assassination. I mean, yeah, there had been a plot. They had tried to take out Theodoric, to overthrow, to make a rebellion. You know, it was a very dramatic moment, and the Goths were mobilized once again. You know, they held the arms. They could cause a massive slaughter. So they managed to repress this, and yet the situation was pretty damn complicated now. So in a short time after the death of Theodoric as well, but even before actually, there was even the collapse of this very important diplomatic net that Theodoric had managed to build with all these marriages with all the other Romano-Germanic elites scattered all over Europe. All the years creating a protective perimeter around Italy were broken down by the Franco-Byzantine coalition. Theodoric was able to temporarily salvage some of his realm with the assistance of the Thuringians, right? That in this sense represented that the Thuringians were basically pagan still in this time, but they were backing the Aryan Goths, because they recognized that that if they hadn't, if the Goths had fallen, they would have been knocked out by the Franks, as it would happen, telling the truth, and realizing that the Franks were the most significant threat to the Visigothic Empire as well. Alaric II, who was the son-in-law of Theodoric himself, enlisted the aid of the Burgundians and fought against the Franks at the urging of the magnates of his people, but this choice proved an error, and he allegedly met his end at the end of the same Frankish king, Clovis, which was a major event, as you know. A time of confusion followed the death of Alaric II, who was slain during the Battle of Vouillé himself, where the Visigoths were crushed by the Franks and lost Aquitaine. It's actually at this point that that Theodoric himself stepped in as the guardian of his grandson Amalaric in Spain, and preserved for him his Iberian and a fragment of his Gallic dominion. Right, Toulouse, that had been the capital of the Visigoths, passed to the Franks, while the Goths kept Narbonne and its district, and Septimania, which was the last part of Gaul held by the Goths, keeping the name of Gothia, in fact, for many years. While Theodoric lived, the Visigothic kingdom was practically united to his own dominion. He seems also to have claimed a kind of protectorate over the Germanic powers generally, and indeed to have practically exercised it, except in the case of the Franks. Right, so an enormous system. From 508-511, under Theodoric's command, the Ostrogoths marched on Gaul, as the Vandal king of Carthage and Clovis had concerted a force to weaken his hold on the Visigoths. The Vandals here didn't play it, probably extremely smartly, in the sense that, as you know, they would be the first kingdom to be wiped out by the Byzantines. So if instead of backing the Franks against the Goths, they had maybe nominally accepted Ostrogothic rule and maintaining direct control, however, of their affairs in Africa, maybe they would have survived, or at least had a longer life, or a different story. Instead, it wasn't the case. Of course, the Visigoths, as we've seen before, were exposed to this Western Ostrogothic Mediterranean constantly, so probably they were pressured by the Goths themselves at the point maybe it was actually fair for them to rebel, to act to the detriment of the Ostrogothic system. Anyway, on the death of Theodoric in 526, the Eastern and Western Goths were once again divided, and by the late, this phase opened to a disgregation of all what Theodoric had been working on in his entire life, especially diplomatically speaking, but not only. The picture that we can get is that after Theodoric, the Gothic power immediately contracted in some ways. Italy and Spain were not connected anymore, or at least they started having kind of more autonomous direction of their affairs. The Goths prepared, in a certain sense, to this clash with the empire, but at the same time, what probably weakened them from the within was this reaction to the necessarily despotic rule that the Ostrogothic monarchy in Italy had required. Right, as we were saying before, you can't rule such an immense domain without sacrificing partly the freedom of all these of the Ostrogothic people as such, in their in the relation with the locals was very important in this, because as we've seen, probably also the Goths began to mix with the local population. It started changing even their allegiances. The sedentarization created different clienteles, and this created further problems. At the same time, the Frankish king Clovis was fighting protracted wars against various enemies while consolidating his rule, and therefore isolating complexively the Ostrogothic power from the rest of of Europe. So then we come to the Gothic War, this extremely violent clash fought between 535-553 that eventually would make the Ostrogoths fundamentally disappear as an independent polity. So, absent the unifying presence of Theodoric, the Ostrogoths and Visigoths were unable to consolidate their realms despite their common Germanic kingship. The few instances where they acted together after this time are as scattered and incidental as they were before. Amalaric succeeded to the Visigothic kingdom of Iberia and Septimania. Theodoric's grandson Athalaric on the mantle as king of the Ostrogoths for the next 5 years. Provence was added to the dominion of the new Ostrogothic king Athalaric, and through his daughter Amalasuntha, who was named regent. Right. However, both were unable to settle disputes among Gothic elites. This was the real problem, and especially Theodad, cousin of Amalasuntha and nephew of Theodoric through his sister, took over and slew them. Actually, Amalasuntha's letter from prison to Constantinople was allegedly a casus belli that Justinian used in order to intervene in Italy. The same Theodad's usurping ushered in more bloodshed, and atop this fighting, the Ostrogoths faced the doctrinal challenges incurred from their Arian Christianity, which both the aristocracy of Constantinople and the papacy strongly opposed, so much that it brought them together once again. So now you understand why Theodoric had been very clever, instead to even if in contradiction, but kind of trying to back both of the policies, to be philo-Catholic when it concerned the relation with the papacy, and Arian when it it concerned the ethnic matters of the Germans. The weakness of the Ostrogothic position in Italy now showed itself, particularly when Justinian enacted a law excluding pagans, among them also Arian Christians and Jews, from public employment. Right, Justinian was tightening the grip on the religious control over the empire. He closed the philosophy school of Athens. He discriminated against, in fact, the Arians, the Jews. So this was a moment of recompacting the Roman imperial unity as a prodrome to the reconquest of the Mediterranean under a sole Roman Catholic power. And this had, as we have seen before, caused Theodoric to react by persecuting Catholics as well. So nonetheless, Justinian always strove to restore as much as the Western Empire as he could, and certainly would not pass up the opportunity. And this is how the Gothic War began. That launched on both land and sea, Justinian began the war. In 535, he commissioned Belisarius, his loyal general, to attack the Ostrogoths, following the success he had in North Africa against the Vandals. Right, so they conquered first Africa, then Sicily, then Italy. Just like the Allies in World War II. And that was very clever to do because, of course, Africa and Sicily excuse me, were full of agricultural resources. So in order to feed the army, that in the case of the Belisarius ones wasn't particularly large, but still, we are talking about the 6th century. Resources are pretty scanty. That was a pretty sensible thing to do. So naturally, as a Roman emperor, it was Justinian's intention to recover Italy and Rome from the Goths, right? Belisarius quickly captured Sicily, then crossed into Italy, where he captured Naples, an important port for connection with Sicily, and eventually conquering Rome in the December of 536. Sometime during the spring of 537, the Goths marched on Rome themselves, under the leadership of the new king Vitiges, who was the king of the Ostrogoths in Italy between 536 and 540. Who led siege to the city, albeit unsuccessfully. Was a very bitter siege. Part of the aqueducts were destroyed. The city was abandoned at one point during the war. It was a pretty. This is where Rome suffered the heaviest blow. Like the sack of the Visigoths and the Vandals didn't alter Rome's power. Well, it was depleted with riches for a few, but it remained a big city. Well, this is the moment in which things start going pretty bad. So here Procopius tells the stories of how basically the dual campaign of Italy was, and he stresses especially the Gothic incapability of dealing with pitched battles, siege warfare, naval warfare. And this is a bit stereotypical. Nevertheless, it's plausibly true, but it shouldn't be interpreted as a very negative thing. From the Gothic side anyway, because this meant that the Goths at this point in history were confident enough and acquainted well enough with Roman culture and civilization that they thought they could fight and win the Romans using their own arms, right? This proved unsuccessful. The Goths lost because of battles, sieges, and naval battles under Vitiges. And for example, at the siege of Rome, the Romans were outnumbered by 5-1 march, right? And yet they maintained the control in the rest of the campaign as well. Belisarius made it anyway to crush against. So Belisarius' troops were mostly mounted. This is also very interesting. It shows a certain direction of the military philosophy of the empire at this point. There were lots of foreign troops as well coming, from for example, Hunnic military influence. At this time, the Romans, after the fall of Attila's empire, had hired lots of bands of Huns that had proved very valuable cavalrymen, of course, and partly the Ostrogoths, as we have seen, had shared partly of that military expertise. So actually, in the Italic War by Procopius, there is a lot of cavalry clashes that also proves that the Goths they were pretty skilled like that, even if probably in Italy they didn't have many horses as they had previously had. Italy never had many horses. It maybe has even good ones, but not many. So for a people that probably was used to fight on horseback, that was a problem of, if anything, of replenishment. And after recuperating from siege warfare, Belisarius marched north, taking Mediolanum, Milan, and the Ostrogoth capital of Ravenna in 540. With the attack on Ravenna, Vitiges and his men were trapped in the Ostrogothic capital. Belisarius proved more capable of siege warfare than his rival. Vitiges had been at Rome, and the Ostrogoth ruler, who was also dealing with Frankish enemies at this point, who intervened in the peninsula, was forced to surrender, but not without terms. Belisarius refused to grant any concession save unconditional surrender in view of the fact that Justinian wanted to make Vitiges a vassal king in Transpadane Italy. And this condition made for something of an impasse. Now, we don't clearly know what happened. We know definitely that the Goths had still manpower available, and I made a video that is called the Atlantic Justinian Reconquest and Atlantic Perspective, that actually wants to show you how the Byzantines at this point weren't much worried. I mean, especially at this point that they had literally crushed the Goths in deciding of their fate to annihilate them, but on the contrary to use them against the Franks and Frankish expansionism by creating this client state in the Po Valley. This is what they probably tried to do with the Longobards as well. Many people think the Longobards simply invaded Italy, but chances are that they were actually called by the Byzantines into it, also because for years there wasn't any military reaction to the Longobard migration. And for the same exact reason, they wanted to stop Frankish expansionism that at this point was, albeit operating in concert with the Byzantines against the Goths, would probably and could be able partly to overthrow even the same Byzantine, or to compromise at least Byzantine rule in at least in northern Italy. In other parts, at the end of the Gothic War, the Franks and the Alemanni would attack into even up to southern Italy. So that gives you the idea of what their power was capable of. So a faction of the Gothic nobility pointed out that their own king Vitiges, who had just lost, was something of a weakling, and they would need a new one. Right? This is the strong Germanic reaction pride that doesn't give up, says, okay, we will not, like, as long as we can fight, we will not be subjected to anyone, and we will keep on fighting till death. And this was probably the hardest core, like the one that had at this point it was a matter of survival in some ways as an autonomous political entity, right? So it wasn't, they preferred to risk their own lives, especially exploiting this moment of a halt of Byzantine military activity to revive their power. Eraric, the leader of this group, endorsed Belisarius, and the rest of the kingdom agreed, so they offered him their crown. This is a bit of a story that we can't assess whether it's true. Belisarius was a soldier, or a statesman, and still loyal to Justinian. He made as if to accept the offer, rode to Ravenna to be crowned, and promptly arrested the leaders of the Goths and reclaimed their entire kingdom. No halfway settlements for the empire. And fearful that Belisarius might set himself up a permanent kingship should he consolidate his conquests, Justinian recalled him to Constantinople with Vitiges in tow, right? So as soon as Belisarius was gone, the remaining Ostrogoths elected a new king named Totila. And this figure is probably one of the most... Totila means the mortal, right? This idea that this incarnation of the Gothic comeback, and much more than that. But the coming back of a different model. Now, that is paradoxical, because as we were saying before, we tend to think about the Ostrogoths as like the conquerors, right, of Italy, and that the Romans were trying to get rid of. This is very different now. The Italics want the Goths at this point, and this is the point of the whole story. Totila is elected in this very dramatic moment in which the people has already been defeated, but they still have forces to mount up a resistance, but that can't last long. They need the help, the numbers of the locals. So Totila does something very clever. He basically speaks to the Italic peasantry, to all these colonists that had been living into the senatorial latifundia, that at this time have been ravaged and devastated by the war. There is misery everywhere. It's a dramatic moment. So Totila says to this peasant, what do you want now? Do you want these senators to come back, and maybe now from the east, to tax you, to have to control you, to treat you like serfs once again? Because that's what the late antique latifundium had become fundamentally. These were nominally freemen, but they had turned into serfs that had lost their freedom, real freedom. So Totila offers them a Germanic model. He tells them, if you fight alongside us, you will gain your freedom. You will be free. You will be free peasants. You will own the land you work, not like these guys that want to control you. And this is probably like one of the single most beautiful things that ever happened. Like in Totila, that at this point was the symbol of the. He was an Aryan. He was an Aryan German, and he's telling the Catholic Italics to join together with him alongside the Germanic freeman warriors. Do you understand what this means? This means that it was nothing about religion. This is nothing about religion. This is about politics. This is your land. Do you want someone else to conquer it and to rule it over you? Or do you want to be like us, who are freemen? We have a piece of land. We don't have latifundia, but we have enough land to live freely. And this is extremely moving, because of course the peasants join and they revive the fight. Under the brilliant command of Totila, the Goths were able to reassert themselves to a degree. For a period of nearly 10 years, control of Italy became a seesaw battle between Byzantine and Ostrogothic forces. Now, this was the toughest moment, actually, because Totila abandoned what Vitiges had done, fighting in open ground and in sieges, and this war of position. He starts a scorched earth strategy. He begins to seriously mess up all the Byzantine supply lines, and guerrilla ensues, and the local populations participate everywhere. So this is actually what in hindsight will destroy Italy, because this is the phase in which Italy gets razed to the ground by armies that pass from one side or another. The whole thing is devastated. This is where the Roman world ends in Italy, and the early Middle Ages begin. Totila eventually recaptured all of northern Italy and even drove the Byzantines out of Rome, right? Thereby affording him the opportunity to take political control of the city, partly by executing the Roman senatorial order. Those senators that had made all that mess, because that war had been triggered by them, now were wiped out. Many fled to Constantinople, others were slaughtered, their land was seized, and the colonists were freed. This was a big deal, right? The papacy wasn't quite the papacy remained as such. The Goths didn't have a real problem with that, even if they were the kind of opponents as Arians. But as we've seen here, there was not a problem. The largest majority of the Italic population was Catholic, and now they were fighting alongside the Goths. So this was taking the measure of an Italic dimension versus the Byzantine one, in a very different from others. And this is important because during late antiquity, there are this kind of regional identities awakening in relation even with these Romano-Germanic kingdoms. I mean, the Visigoths really did something in Spain. The Franks did it in Gaul. The Vandals in Africa. The Anglo-Saxons in Britain eventually, and the Goths with Italy, and the Longobards with Italy. So there is this moment in which the region now, also because the world resources available are running out, so everything is narrowing down to these macro regions as these regions as the true centers of power, even for evident geographical reasons, right? You can well identify, I don't know, what is Italy, what is Spain, what is Gaul, there is a natural boundary in here. It's becoming very meaningful because it's starting to be a matter of political particularism that is being pushed in part by the elites, of course, because all these areas have different histories, but it's being revived also on the base of a regional identic core that wants to be autonomous, right? So Totila's war is amazing in this sense. It's very difficult not to see in Totila kind of a romantic figure, obviously idealizing him and everything. You can imagine it was much more brutal than we can imagine, but it's still very meaningful at the level of what eventually will happen in Italy, because the Longobards will, as we were saying before, take the place of this. They would be able to halt the Byzantine re-expansion. The Byzantines would not make it, and part of the reason is that the local inhabitants wanted them. Contrarily-wise to this believed, I made a video in Longobard history explaining how we perfectly know in modern historiography, since at least a couple of generations, that the Longobards weren't at all a negative factor for the Italian peninsula. They were actually pretty damn good administrators. Like what the Longobards did in Italy wasn't done by any other Romano-Germanic kingdom in terms of civil development over the centuries. And this entails necessarily the participation of the local peasantry, all this of the local population, all these misinterpretations of the Germans separated from the Romans. It's utter and complete rubbish. Nobody believes this anymore in any academy in the world. Read Wickham, it's plenty of study. Like Longobard Italy, in this sense, is extremely meaningful, and much of that, and the reason why the Longobards had it so easy, or relatively easy actually, but still winning, different from the Goths, is what happened here with the Goths. It's with the subversion, if you want, of this late antique system based on the latifundium that the Goths managed to break during the second phase of the Gothic War, and that lets free, in spite getting them, to leading to this massive destruction, to the destruction of Italy in its prosperity in large part, to this breaking free of the local communities that partly will have a great importance in the history of medieval Europe, because it's from that fragmentation that even Italy in its power will, in terms of the renaissance of this particularism, political competition will emerge, will stem from, right? And it's it's a long shot, right? You can see it in different ways. Of course, it was possible. I don't know, even the Longobards had the opportunity of creating kind of a unique system, like a unique monarchy, but eventually the Franks arrived and Pope always in the middle. So, of course, it's but the Goths changed it all, right? Italy had that. Other regions of Europe didn't have this. Like if you take Spain or Gaul, for example, they didn't really have a breaking point. Like, it was never a point in which Gaul was destroyed by a war. There was a very soft transition from Roman times to medieval times. In Italy, this transition was extremely and radically violent, and it passed through this war. That is not a product of the Goths as themselves. It's a product of a war between the Romans and the Goths, or better, between you can't say the Byzantine in the sense that the local Roman population was actually largely for the Goths, and they didn't like much of Byzantine, or especially in the hinterlands, especially in the majority of the population and the peasantry, right? And we know this. We know, in fact, from later times, even the Longobards invasion happened pretty soon here, in a few decades, in like 10 years, 20 years, excuse me. The peasants would flee into Longobard territory because the local Byzantine taxes were too high. They didn't want to pay it, and they joined the Longobard kingdom, right? So reflect on this, because it's extremely meaningful, and it had been started by the Goths. We had finally understood now and seized the opportunity to knock out the senators that had caused all that problem. By 550, Justinian, however, was able to put together an enormous force, an assembly designed to recover his losses and subdue any Gothic resistance. In 551, the Roman navy destroyed Totila's fleet, and in 552, an overwhelming Byzantine force under Narses entered from the north. This was a pincer movement, pretty clever. Narses also was put in charge at the end. He was an extremely efficient administrator and also general. Attempting to surprise the invading Byzantines, Totila gambled with his forces at Tagina, where, however, he was defeated. Right, he was slain. This battle was a crushing blow for the Goths. Although broken but not yet defeated, they would make one final stand in Campania under a chief named Theia, who was the last Ostrogothic king. But when he was also killed in the battle at the Montes Lactari, and the Ostrogoths were obliged to finally capitulate. This war was impressive. This is at the Battle of Tagina. The same Longobards were present in the Byzantine ranks. This was a moment, a very pivotal moment, in which they saw what the Goths had been there, which they realized what Italy was made of. Even the Goths weren't completely wiped out. There were still settlements that were maintained in Byzantine rule, and the Longobards fighting for the Byzantines here immediately started to understand what the situation was, and probably coming back in Pannonia, where they had come from, with Longobards who had been settled now as Roman Federati. They realized now what the opportunities were to settle in there, and still probably with Byzantine approval in part. On surrendering, the Ostrogoths informed Narses that evidently the hand of God was against them, and so they left Italy for the northern lands of their fathers, allegedly. The reality is very different. Actually, most Ostrogoths remained in Italy. Right, of course, after their defeat, the Ostrogothic name wholly died as such. The nation had practically evaporated with Theodoric's death. But actually, it was full of Ostrogothic garrisons, especially in northern Italy and certain areas of the Apennine, that would be the same ones that at the arrival of the Longobards, together with the Rugi, opened the gates of those cities and joined the Longobard people and became Longobards themselves. This is very interesting. It was normal for the time. The Byzantines knew perfectly that wiping out demographically these people was basically useless, right? Because they needed to, as we've seen, the garrison and defend those territories against the invasions of the Franks, so they needed manpower. But this manpower was now simply left there where it was. Like even the Vandals, when the Vandalic Africa was crushed, the Vandalic name disappeared. Some Vandals were hired into the Roman army and sent fighting in the east, but others were remaining where they had always been settled there to remain to defend the African frontier for the Berber populations of the hinterland. Well, so it happened for the Ostrogoths. So if the Ostrogoths lived on, albeit their name disappeared, well, this is within the Longobards, largely. Surely some Germans came back north of the Alps, maybe some came even back to Scandinavia. It was normal, in part, because there was a shared memory of that common origin, but many of them would remain in Italy, the region where they had been born now, because they were, the young ones, even the ones who had fought in the war now, they were sons of, at least of either the sons or grandsons than those who had come with Theodoric, and they would join the Longobards that largely embodied that strongly Germanic and Aryan power that was completely uncompromising with the Romans on the international scenario. The Longobards weren't too repressive with the local population. They were actually pretty, clever in the way that they operated, but they never accepted at that point when they reconstituted the kingdom, and when they constituted the kingdom in Italy, and the Byzantines and Franks tried to wipe them out, to feel part of the empire. They didn't rule on behalf of the empire. They cut off this ambiguity that Ostrogothic Italy had embodied, of being there as Goths but ruling on behalf of the Romans and having always these problems of compromising with the elites. The Longobards never did that. The Longobards arrived there, they found this land that after all the destructions was still, however, some of the richest ones of the Mediterranean, and they decided that that was their land, and that there was a very strongly territorial character of the Longobard rule. The Longobard was a kingdom of Italy, just like the Ostrogothic one had been. They claimed their rule over this land, and they never expected any recognition from the Roman Empire. Those were the Longobards. They had conquered sword in hands, and there is nothing surprising in this sense that so many other peoples, such as the Thuringians or the Suebi, or even the Saxons, who descended together with the Longobards in number of 20,000 in Italy. They joined this model and started ruling from there. Albavin, just like Theodoric, Albavin, king of the Longobards, is recorded into the Nordic sagas of Snorri Sturluson as one of the greatest kings and leaders of men of his time. This glorious world of the migration era was dying out at that point, because the Longobard one was the last major migration into Western Europe, but that had equally accomplished this incredible feat of invading and controlling great parts of what the core land of the Roman Empire was, and winning it against the Romans, right? And this is the beginning of another story, but I thought it was very meaningful to attach it to the Ostrogoths, because much of what the Ostrogoths learned, also at the cost of their life, it is what the Longobards realized and managed to profit from, and to in a certain sense making the Ostrogothic, if not legacy, but Germanism and Arianism surviving. Of course, the Longobards would convert by the mid-7th century to Catholicism, but as we've seen, that was a normal process that occurred in every other Germanic population, and that point in which Arianism had become obsolete, anachronistic, because there wasn't anything at that point to contend under that point of view, when the Germanic population had mixed now completely with the Italic one in that case, but also in the other regions, like also in Spain with the Visigoths, or in Burgundy, that was the case. So the collapse of the Ostrogothic power was very meaningful for the future of Europe. There is a great For example, Cantor writes that the leadership, quote, the leadership of Western Europe passed by default to the Franks. This is true. This is absolutely true, albeit at this point, in the second half, from the second half of the 6th century, even the Frankish capabilities of expanding their power further were halted. Like, you have to wait 2 centuries before the Franks will manage to re-extend their power towards the Mediterranean to make profitable use of it. Actually, there were these other polities that remained: the Longobards in Italy, the Visigoths in Spain, and the same Frankish power basically collapsed into 4 separate kingdoms in Gaul that were united eventually under a single rule only under Carolingian times. Yet, this from the Roman side, you can argue that even the chance of creating a great Italic kingdom was practically lost, because the Longobards, for reasons that we can explain now, but you can look at my dedicated playlist, never quite achieved the control over the entire peninsula like the Goths had done. This was about to happen exactly in the moment in which the Carolingians conquered them. And however, this speaks for the potential of the Italic peninsula even after this massive catastrophe and even the plague that invested the West, at the time of Justinian. That's part of the reason why even the Frankish power wasn't able to re-extend, because there was a brutal demographic and economical contraction. I mean, even the Merovingians had carried out a massive amount of military expeditions all over Western Europe, and they had they had paid for that, because those are not assets that you can recover quite easily. At that time, such expeditions cost a lot, and that reverberates into the generations, right? This failure of the Ostrogoths is to be interpreted, however, as the end of an era, in my opinion. As we've seen, the Goths had been this great point of reference for a great model of that, in a certain sense, was stressing anachronistically the separation between the Romans and the Germans. Or better, the Ostrogoths in Italy actually tried to cope with this contradiction, with this idea, by contradicting it, like tacitly, that is, making the Romans and the Germans coexist as separate and distinct units. But this distinction could not last, right? These peoples mingled together, and the ethnic belonging at that point was mostly a political and administrative identity of belonging to that specific kingdom. Like it would be for the Longobards, basically all the Romano-Italic population would be Longobard and would feel Longobard at one point. Why? Because they were framed under a monarchy with an administration, with a justice, and with a unity that was also, due to the development of economy and the structuration of this territorial power. The Goths represent, in this sense, instead, what the ancient pride and belief of the Germans during the migration era had been. So this model that was living still between Arianism and paganism, in a world at the outskirts of Rome, but not part of Rome as such, and proud of its own uniqueness. The Goths are a people that probably also experienced more successfully the ethnic mix of during the migration era. They managed to build this prosperous kingdom before the Hunnic invasions into the easternmost areas where the Germans had ever fared, and creating it with the support of local populations of Sarmatian origin, of other peoples. And therefore creating something bigger that, if the Hunnic invasions had not occurred, could have been really something to, very fascinating to know how it would have ended. And therefore this further development under as Federati of the Romans and settlement in Italy. So this like great wave of grandeur that triggered even some of the greatest works. Think about the one of Cassiodorus, of this great elegy of the Germans, of their their origins, their military prowess, all things that were sang by these Italic scholars to stress the positivity that the Ostrogothic rule had represented for the peninsula in an autonomous sense, and witnessing this destructive death that is the most ferocious and probably also one of the most heroic, that we have probably lost this part of it because it was a defeat at the end. Dietrich von Bern is the one who fights against, although he's the victorious one. As far as you know, there is not the song of the fall of the Goths, or maybe there is hidden in the echoes of the Germanic sagas, but it's still probably the way as how many Gothic warriors would have liked to go, right? Obviously, they would have preferred their legacy to live on, their names to live on, their blood lived on. The Ostrogoths their seed didn't disappear from the face of the earth. They lived into other peoples. They lived into other peoples, into other nations. They lived into Crimea, as we have seen. They lived into Italy. They lived into other regions they crossed. And they, however, earned their place in history as one of the most powerful of the Romano-Germanic kingdoms in this first phase of their power, and their fall is equal to their greatness, in my opinion. I think it was very beautiful to talk about them today. I also learned more about them because, frankly, I knew the Ostrogoths largely, but it is important to understand certain perspectives, certain views of this world, and the way they somewhat managed to go through it and to have such an amazing history like the one they had, and from which we surely can learn a lot, not just relatively to the period, but also about ourselves, about how societies are posed in front of dramatic changes and how they can react to that, how they can cope with it. That is particularly meaningful every day, in every time in history, and especially I think particularly today, because this is a moment that is much more troubled than what we are willing to acknowledge, and we should be mindful of these stories because they can tell us a lot in the end of the day of what we can be, and also partly what we have been, which is never to forget, as it's the only way to know what we can be and what we can do, right? So I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.